The following is a DW Old Testament production. Continuing his search for pasturage, Abraham moved to Beersheba, some 20 miles southwest of Hebron. There he and his men dug a well of their own. A short time later, a dispute arose between Abraham and a local chieftain, Abimelech, whose servants had wrongfully captured the well. The two men finally came to an agreement, which they confirmed by taking an oath. According to tradition, Beersheba, or Well of the Oath, was named for that pact. During this time, God unexpectedly tested Abraham. "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Genesis 22:2. Abraham was stunned. Offerings to God were almost always rams or young lambs. A human being was never sacrificed. In the most famous of the Abraham stories, the grief-stricken father obeyed and traveled to the location with his son. Taking with him two servants, Abraham and Isaac traveled to the land of Moriah. We have absolutely no data to determine the exact age of Isaac at the time, but the computation of Josephus, that he was 25 years old, makes him more advanced than the language of the scripture narrative seems to convey to our minds. 2 days they had traveled from Beersheba, when on the third, the mountains round about Jerusalem came into sight. From a gap between the hills which forms the highest point on the ordinary road, which has always led up from the south, just that one mountain would be visible on which afterwards the temple stood. Leaving the servants behind, father and son pursued their solitary road. Isaac carrying the wood, and Abraham the sacrificial knife and fire. Building an altar at the specified location, Abraham bound his compliant son and positioned him for the sacrifice. Abraham held his knife and prepared himself mentally for such a devastating task. This moment was Abraham's ultimate test of faith in God. He had been asked to trust God. He had given up country, kindred, and home, and then his paternal affection toward Ishmael. It yet remained to give up even Isaac, the goal of his longing, the hope of his life, the joy of his old age, all that was dearest to him, to show absolute faith and confidence in God. Upon Isaac also, the event had a most important bearing, for which he resisted not his father, and allowed himself to be bound and laid on the altar. He entered into the spirit of Abraham and complete trust in God, and thus showed himself truly the heir to the promises. Later Christians would look upon this event after God sacrificed his only begotten Son on the cross. But the angel of the Lord called to him, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hand on the child or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your only son from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behind him was a ram, and Abraham offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Genesis 22:11. Thus, Abraham's faith was truly tested, and his unswerving loyalty was rewarded by yet another divine blessing of prosperity, long life, and peace. After the offering up of Isaac, Abraham lived many years, yet scarcely any event worth recorded in Scripture occurred during their course. He and Isaac returned to Beersheba and resumed their routines of the shepherding life, moving their camp whenever better land and water could be found. Eventually, Abraham resettled his tribe back to Hebron, where they had lived for so many years. Time passed, and Abraham's love for Isaac grew. He taught his son the same things he had learned from his own father, Terah, the duties and skills of shepherding, the use of the plow, and the history of his ancestors. More importantly, he raised Isaac to believe in the covenant with Yahweh. At Hebron, Sarah died at the age of 127. She is the only woman whose age is recorded in Scripture. Isaac at the time was 37. Having no burial land of his own, Abraham appealed to some neighboring Hittites to sell him a plot of land containing a cave, which he could use as a tomb. At first, the Hittites offered him the free use of their tombs, but eventually Abraham persuaded Ephron, the Hittite, to sell him his plot of land with the cave of Machpelah. This, a burial site, was the first property the Hebrews owned in the land that God had promised them. In this cave of Machpelah lie treasured the remains of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah, of Leah also, and the embalmed bodies of Jacob and perhaps Joseph. No other location in the Holy Land holds so much precious dust as this, and it is, among all the holy places of the Old Testament, the only one which to this day can be pointed out with perfect certainty. The site over the cave itself is covered by a sanctuary which stands enclosed within a quadrangular building 200 feet long, 115 feet wide, and 50 or 60 feet high, the walls of which are divided by pilasters about 5 feet apart, about 2.5 feet wide. This building, with its immense stones, one of which is no less than 38 feet long, must date from the time of David or of Solomon. The mosque within it was probably anciently a church. 3 years after the death of Sarah, Abraham resolved to fill the gap in his own family and in the heart of Isaac by seeking a wife for his son. Abraham did not want him to wed a Canaanite girl, but neither did he want him to leave Canaan in search of a wife. Instead, Abraham sent his steward to Haran, most likely Eleazar of Damascus, the elder of his house, who ruled over all that was his. When his steward arrived, he was met by a lovely young girl who offered him water from the jug she carried, and she took him to her parents' house, where he was given food and lodging. The girl was Rebekah, granddaughter of Abraham's brother. On learning who she was, the steward told her parents and her brother Laban the reason for his journey. The steward then gave Rebekah and her family the gifts he had brought: gold and silver rings and bracelets, fine clothing, and other costly ornaments. The next day, the steward and Rebekah, accompanied by her maids, departed Canaan. Their arrival ended with a peaceful and happy marriage. Nothing else remains to be told of the 38 years which followed the death of Sarah. We read indeed that Abraham took a wife, Keturah. They became the ancestors of Arab tribes, which are sometimes alluded to in holy writings. And so, through the impressive silence of so many years as make up a generation, Scripture brings us to the death of Abraham. Isaac and Ishmael, both aged men, would reunite peacefully to bury their father. When Abraham was 175 years old, he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. Genesis 25:8. His son Ishmael returned to help bury his father next to Sarah at Machpelah. During the next years of Isaac's life, he and his tribe traveled from place to place, from oasis to another, between Beersheba and Gerar, 20 miles to the northwest. They usually settled long enough in each place to dig a well near the camp and to raise crops of grain nearby. Sometimes disputes arose between the Canaanites and the Hebrew shepherds over the use of wells already dug. When that happened, Isaac usually chose to move on rather than argue with the more heavily armed Canaanites. Later in his life, Isaac returned to his former home at Beersheba. There God renewed the promise of land he had made to Abraham. Abimelech, the local chieftain who had befriended Abraham, approached Isaac offering the same peace treaty, and the two groups remained in peace for many years. Despite Yahweh's blessings and his friendly relations with the local Canaanites, Isaac's family life was far from tranquil. His twin boys, Jacob and Esau, would grow up as complete opposites of each other, and together they would cause complete turmoil within the tribe. Thank you for joining us.